Hey, Philip, how are you doing?
Hey, yeah, good. And you?
Oh, perfect. No kidding. Tomorrow a conference, so I have prepared a few
Nice.
slides, and code will happen. But yeah, so therefore I'm in a good mood. And yeah, where are you located now? Are you in Australia?
Yes, I'm in Melbourne, Australia.
Ah, okay.
Yeah,
And how late and how early is it?
it's now 5 in the morning.
Oh, I didn't knew that. So I would schedule a little bit later. So
No, but
yeah,
this is fine. Yeah, 5 is
yeah.
fine.
This is dedication.
Well, I couldn't do last night, which is actually probably better. Usually my meetings are at night because it aligns with Europe's morning.
Hmm.
But yeah, if I have meetings with the US, it's usually early morning for me.
Oh, perfect. So then let's start with the somehow important question. What was your first computer?
My first computer.
Hmm.
S- So I would say this is long ago. It was like a 286 or something. I don't really know
Intel.
computers that well. Yeah, 286 that my dad brought home from his work, and I can't recall too much about it. I know we it had PC tools on it, and I played Prince of Persia and Dig Dug and things like that.
I don't know Dig
This
Dug,
was
but Prince of Persia was very popular back then.
yeah. um, there was no Windows on it, if I remember correctly. There was
DOS,
DOS. Yeah,
DOS exactly.
yeah,
Windows 3.11 happened later, uh, and
yeah. Because this must have been before. Like I was in my last year in school was 1997, so this must be like 1990. Yeah, 1991 to two when I was
yeah,
still at school. Yeah,
this is possible because
yeah.
I don't know. I think 88 I had a Spectrum, and later the PCs came, and as I remember, 1992 there were the 386, and gaming started basically back then.
Yeah.
So
This could
so
have been a 386. As I said, I can't remember.
this is
I
not that
wasn't.
important. What interests me the most to know, was it more like PC like, or was it like C64 and ZX Spectrum?
Yeah.
But you are a young developer. This is you started, already with Intel. Most of my guests they have ZX Spectrum on C64 or
Okay.
CPC or the um, TRS 80, I think the fresh from US.
Okay.
And when you started coding or scripting or something, your first, so how it
So
happened?
we had some computer classes at school, but at that point I wasn't too into it. Where you kind of coded the mouse to go 5 forward, or not the mouse. I can't remember what it was, but the thing to go 5 forward and then turn and then left. And that's about the coding I've done on school. And then I didn't start studying computer science either. I started with actuarial science, and then luckily very
What
soon
science?
actuarial science.
Hmm.
But then very soon realized I'm way too lazy to pass this. And luckily at that point, one of the subjects that I had on university was computer science.
Hmm.
So in computer science one, we did Visual Basic, but
Hmm.
um, I really liked like programming because then that was really the first time I got into programming. So yeah, I 6 months later I switched to computer science, and then I actually got my when then I kind of more got into computers, and then me and my dad went to like a shop that that's actually selling anything because we didn't know anything about computers. But I remember I bought a Packard Bell, which was like a brand back then,
Hmm.
like
I
a
remember.
package.
I
Yeah,
almost forgot it. This Packet Bell. This is a nice
Packard
name
Bell.
actually, but yeah.
Yeah, so that was a Pentium, and that ran I think 98 Windows 98.
Hmm.
Because then yeah, like I said, I switched to computer science. Um, and
So
then
what
in
means is if you are
second,
lazy, you should study computer science, right? So this is
yeah,
what
for
we
sure.
learn. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
you'll work
This
the
is
rest
a
of your life to make your life easier.
So after 300 episodes of Airhex FM, we learned the first useful thing, right? So if you are lazy,
Yeah,
study computer science, nothing can go
yeah,
wrong.
yeah. Yeah, so in the second year, because then I switched to computer science, so then luckily I didn't lose a year. So the second year I just had that as my major, computer science, and that's when we started with Java.
Wow,
But
that early. Yeah, it was already
yeah,
in
so that
1990s. Mm-hmm.
19 that would have been 1999, and
Mm-hmm.
I would assume the Java would have been 1.2 somewhere there.
So around 2000 there was one too. So I suppose a 118 or something like this. The
Yeah,
first JIT was around. So you were
yeah,
lucky already. Mm-hmm.
yeah. But back then I didn't realize all the things that's in Java because we kind of learned data structures and algorithms, and so we had to code our own map. And I didn't realize, oh, there's actually a collection framework, which I think probably only came later.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was more a language to learn coding than it was learning Java.
One of my first project was actually, to evaluate collection frameworks. So there were lots of them. I remember there's Rockwave. They're still
Oh
there,
wow,
the company, yeah. They're the Java. And there were like 3 frameworks I evaluated, and then the Java collections came out afterwards. Mm-hmm.
so this like around that time, 1999, 2000, or
Mm-hmm.
okay, yeah,
So I started with it was before it was called Java, I think even. But then I got a very early project. So I remember we migrated 118. I was really curious about 118 because this was the JIT compiler and everything was supposed, to be faster. But
okay,
Java was tiny. So what I remember, the entire JDK was like 5 megs download. So it
wow.
was very, very small. Mhm. And okay, and but you enjoyed programming. So what you learned before
Yeah.
Java, C, or what was your trajectory? And I suppose it was in Australia as well, right? Your study.
No, this was in South Africa.
Ah, okay. Hmm.
Yeah, so I'm South African originally. We've only been in Australia, and end of this year will be 3 years.
Oh, okay. So where
Yeah,
you
so
studied then? Which city?
this was back then it was called Rand Afrikaans University.
Hmm.
It's now called University of Johannesburg. Yeah,
Hmm. Oh, okay. Okay, and
yeah,
they delivered Java that early. This is interesting, actually.
yeah. So Visual Basic in the first year, and then Java second year. I know the year before I think we were the first that did Java, or yeah, because the year before us still did C. So we were the Java guinea pigs.
Okay.
Um, yeah,
And
but like I
you
said,
had. Mhm.
it's not really that we've learned Java. I walked out of university and I wouldn't been able, I wasn't a Java. I wouldn't call myself a Java developer because
Mhm.
we've learned concepts, but I've only learned Java when I started working.
Okay, so you started working after the university, or?
Yes, so I continued studying because I did my honors part time, but part of the university was a third year project which the industry came to evaluate. So I got offered a job at one of the big banks in my third year.
Mhm.
So then I decided to switch to part time, and because after 3 years you get your BSc, and then I did my honors part time. And at that big bank, they were a big Java shop, I think still today.
Mhm.
And I worked at a corporate site that used a thick client for their banking clients because
Mhm.
they have a handful of clients. They have like, yeah, let's say less than 100 clients,
Mhm.
and they all have a thick client with a banking app basically. And this was all at that point. I think mostly AWT, and I was part of my job was converting it to Swing. So my first job
Mhm.
was Java Swing, which I
And you
really
applied for
enjoyed.
the job, or were you freelancer, or
No,
how?
no, no. That was the nice thing is that the bank was one of the evaluators of our third year project,
Huh?
and they basically just said, if you want a job, yeah, you've got a job. So, and they continued then to pay for the rest of my studies. So that was nice.
Cool.
Yeah, so that was the backend was Java, and at that point it was like a Corba RMI call.
RMI over Corba. This was RMI over IOP is the term.
Yes,
This
yes,
was,
yeah, exactly. And I'm trying to remember. So we switched to J2E at some point at my time there. I can't remember exactly how far in, because this must have been early 2000s. But yeah, I was mostly, especially in the beginning, I was mostly working on Swing. This app as well at that point didn't, but part of the work that I did was to make it work with WebStart, so it's easier way to distribute it to the client.
yes.
Which WebStart was actually a really cool tech, and it's a pity that it kind of died. But
yeah, there were lots of companies which were really happy with WebStart. And the listeners, what WebStart was, it's like applets without applets. So you can this was basically a custom class loader, so you can download jars, signed jars from somewhere, and execute them. And this WebStart had also some almost cloudy services. Like there was a little bit of storage. You could also have configuration, and this was basically the WebStart. And then it was killed. It was part of Java. And there was a JNLP, Java Network Launch Protocol file, right? So if you double click on the file, the application was installed. Which IDE I use? JBuilder, Semantic Visual Cafe?
Yeah, at that point, the bank used JBuilder, so I used JBuilder. And I thought it was the best thing ever. And I think about 4 or 5 years into it, one of the guys in the team started using Eclipse, and then I switched to Eclipse. Yeah. But JBuilder was actually quite a nice IDE.
JBuilder was perfect. The only problem with JBuilder was the renaming or refactoring was not that great. And Eclipse killed everything because Eclipse shipped with a really good refactoring. And the refactoring, what I mean by refactoring is just Eclipse was able to consistently rename classes, references to classes, which was not possible in JBuilder back then. And I killed actually JBuilder with Eclipse. So in the project, I just introduced Eclipse, and it always survived. And then JBuilder, what they did, they transformed to be a plugin for Eclipse, which was beginning of the end. This was the last,
Yeah. So I also eventually moved into some backend code then with J2EE. And actually at the bank, I did my first open source work, even though it was like a one-man show and just me. And back then there was no Git and there was no blogs and none of that. So I can't remember exactly where this code was hosted, but I've written 2 Swing components. I called it Easy Calendar and Easy Grid. And grid is like a table, but the table is sortable, and I can't remember all the features that it had. And it was used because I had mails of people asking me for features or saying that they're using it. And that was quite cool. So at that, or the feeling that you get when you realize somebody uses your software somewhere in the world.
SourceForge, I guess.
Yeah, it could be something like that. But
there was a SourceForge, and I think Codehouse from Google.
Yeah, I think it was SourceForge. And I must have the code somewhere, like on a disk or a CD or something. But yeah, it won't be really, I think, applicable. I think there's much better components out today. But back then there wasn't, especially the calendar, there wasn't anything like that, at least free. And yeah, like I said, I got into J2E at that point, did a lot of XML and XML transformations and things like that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which I also love. I think it's quite powerful. Probably
it was actually functional, right? So this is XSLT was a functional programming language, and this is somehow similar to CSS even. So you could pick nodes and do something with them. And there was the XSS, and Cirrus and Xenon, right? There were
Yeah,
two
yeah, exactly.
Apache projects, and FOB was
Yeah,
crazy because with XSLT you can transform XML to FOB, and FOB was
yeah, to
able to
PDF.
generate PDF, which
Yeah,
was very slow back
that's
then, but
exactly.
it worked, right? So,
Yeah, exactly.
mhm,
So at the bank, that's exactly what we did. So we, in one of the projects, because you generate your reports with PDF
mhm,
for these banking clients. So that's exactly how we did it. And then about 5 or so years later, left the bank and moved into a consulting company.
mhm,
And there I got more involved with like more design architecture. Um,
mhm,
so we worked at different companies, but mostly also banks and insurance companies and things like that, where we would, and at that point also a lot of Java E, designing Java E. Back then patterns was big, so yeah,
mhm,
applying a pattern to some big architecture.
mhm.
Um, so that was also fun. Yeah,
Which were your was it 2006, 7?
yeah, exactly. Somewhere there, I think
Mhm,
2005, 2006, 2007, somewhere
mhm,
there. Um, and then in 2008, we decided to leave Johannesburg and
mhm,
move down to the coast. And I joined a small startup. Um, and that was actually very interesting work that we did at the startup because that was the move. My first time I moved from usually working for big companies, whether it's directly or via some consultancy company, to a startup where things just changed
mhm,
totally because there's no budget. You don't have a
mhm,
yearly budget to spend on something. There's no dedicated person to do something. So you walk in there, and then if you're the IT guy, then you need to set up the server, do the hosting, do the development, take it into production, do the prod support, and even set up the telephone system because you're the closest to to that. So
mhm.
for me, that was a nice change and eye opening um, because I was always in this environment where it's all just taken care of. And what we did at this small startup is also fairly interesting because at that point there was no smartphones yet. It was just normal feature phones,
Mhm.
and the .mobi site was quite big. I don't know if it was ever really big outside of Africa, but
No,
in
I never heard
Africa,
about that. Dot Mobi, you say?
.mobi exactly, yeah. So this would be a website for a company. So usually a company would have their normal website, and then
Mhm,
they would have a .mobi website, which is
mhm,
specifically for mobile phones. And this, like I said, is quite big in Africa because there's a few reasons. Africa, a lot of people throughout Africa's first and only connection to the internet is via their mobile phone,
mhm,
even today.
mhm.
Today, the mobile phone might just be smart, but back then it was uh, Motorola V3 or Nokia something.
Razor, right, was big.
Exactly, a Razer or yeah. So the only interaction with the internet is via this device that is really small and can't handle websites because every phone. I mean, I don't know how many user agents we could handle, but it was in the thousands of user
Mhm.
agents that we checked the user agent. There was a database called Wordful. I don't know if you know Wordful.
No.
I think it's this a guy in Italy that created this open source database called Wordful. And that database is really just a file that contains user agents for phones and then
Mhm,
map. And then once you have the user agent, you can get all the features of a phone. So you
mhm,
can use it for two things. One, analytics. So figuring out if you capture the user agent of the traffic, you can do analytics to what type of phones hit your website.
mhm,
But you could also customize the output for that phone because some phones has a specific deck size. So if your website is larger than 10 meg, it would fail. And
mhm,
so then you can build clever paging in. Some didn't support the full HTML. Some can't do PNG with backgrounds. And yeah, there was a whole list of things that we had to cater for. So that was quite an interesting problem. And like I said, in Africa, apart from the fact that most people have mobile phones as their first and only connection to the internet, the internet's also quite expensive. So you want to try and optimize the amount of data that goes over the network to the handset, because every bit that you download is money. At a country that is fairly poor compared to Europe, as an example. So that's kind of what we've done, because we also, so it was twofold. It was to give them better internet access, because a website just loads too slow or can't load. So now these companies will come to us and we will create a mobi site so that it's browsable. But we also started building a platform that allows you to build a website using your mobile phone, which is also quite interesting. Yeah. And that I've at that point used portlets to do this. And even now, I like the portlet spec. I think portlets probably is dead or dying. I don't think a lot of people are still using them, but the spec itself was actually quite nice. And I've always said, I know it's not a popular thing to say, but I think if we can kind of revamp the portlet spec, it could be something useful in a microservice architecture, because it does fit. If you think micro frontends and you can do remote portlets, that will fit nicely on a server-side rendering type application. But anyway,
there are lots of such technologies, because if you think about this, server-side rendering, right, has a big time right now. So even in JavaScript, they recognize, if you just have a fat client basically in the browser, which communicates with API with the server, this maybe is not ideal.
Yeah.
And in Java, we did it. This is how it started. So servlets was nothing but server-side rendering. And I think what I'm missing is not even portlets. Is maybe a pragmatic JSPs would be enough. You have something like 80% of JSPs with a very because JSPs were extremely fast. What happened behind the scenes? They were compiled into a servlet, which this was as fast as string concatenation, basically.
Yeah.
And this could be actually really interesting for more stuff. So, by the way, my blog. So I completely refactored my blog. What this basically is, the template engine in my blog is string replace all. So I don't need much. So and it is served by Quarkus as a string, and I'm basically done. So I built it on a weekend. And if I will need a little bit more, then I would be in trouble. But JSPs would be very, very similar, actually.
Well, what you can look at, which is pretty new, is
Qt.
Well, there's a new project called ROQ, ROQ. I don't know if you've looked at that.
Quarkus project or
Quarkus extension.
Okay, ROQ.
Quarkus ROQ. Yeah,
no,
and that does kind of what you're saying. So it's mostly Andy that done that.
This is the static page generator, right? Exactly.
Yeah. So that does.
But they knew that the name is ROQ, but
yeah, and it uses Qt as a template engine, or it can use Qt as a template engine. So that might be something that's interesting. I haven't looked at it too much, but I know it's there.
And portlets were interesting. The problem with portlets was they were used in all enterprises, but completely misused, because they never had a good use case, or they only knew they have to use portlets without knowing why. And what happened then is, I would say 80% of all cases I saw in the wild was that they only used the menu system from the portlets, and nothing else was used. So basically there was one huge, how to call it, portlet view, and the menu system, and is basically it. And the idea that microfront and stuff like that, it had lots of problems back then, because people were not accustomed to have isolated views. They wanted to have modularization with complete customization, and this was the combination of both was really hard to achieve. So this was the problem a bit back then. So maybe maybe the main problem of the entire enterprise software back then was that enterprise architects, without understanding the technology, they ordered all the stuff and cost millions and forced developers to build something with it, and the developers had no idea why it's there. So it's okay, I have something, I don't need it, but let's use it. I was in projects where everything worked, and afterwards they told us, now you have to use the ESB. And I said, well, for what? I mean, we are almost done. Why we need ESB? Yeah, you have to use it. We already invested. Okay, then I will do something with it, but I actually don't need it, right?
Yeah.
This was a bit a problem back then.
Yeah, and I also think like the way in which how we use portlets is we started by reading the spec, so we understood what portlets was. But after that, I worked at another company that also used portlets, but it was basically one of the big vendors that sold them this solution, and you use the solution without actually understanding the tech underneath it.
Mm-hmm.
But what we did is at the startup, we used Apache Pluto on Glassfish, and we didn't use JSP.
Which Apache? Well, I miss didn't Apache.
Pluto.
Pluto, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Pluto I think it was a reference implementation.
Yeah.
On Glassfish, and used Velocity to create the front end.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Apache Velocity. What was
Velocity? Apache Velocity.
Yeah. Because we were kind of creating outputs per user agent, we used Velocity to have these different templates for this group of user agents that handle specific features of HTML. And yeah, we've done other interesting things we've done there is because, like I said, some phones can't do transparent GIFs or PNGs. Then we would have an icon in a SVG and then dynamically create the image based on the background that it's currently on.
It's crazy.
Dynamically, yeah. There was some really cool stuff we've done, and then a lot of RSS and Atom feeds. So again, a lot of XML and XML transformations. And then smartphones came out and basically made us null and void, because then suddenly the phones can do what the computer can do. So .mobi sites never really went anywhere. I don't know if there's still .mobi sites out there, but most people can now just browse it.
And this .mobi was the standard?
Yeah, it was. Yeah,
no, not the standard. The .mobi was your company. This was the question.
No. The company was called Thumbtribe. I think they're still around, but they've pivoted into something else.
Okay. In Germany or Europe, the WAP, wireless access protocol, I think, the WAP pages, WAP, there was the standard for the feature phones. And they were like very basic HTML, which I never did this because I never believed in the thing. But I know that it was big. There are companies who did it actually in Europe.
Yeah.
Okay, what happened then? We are talking about 2010. I think iPhone, the first one was 2007. It took a few years until the industry recognized it's over, right? So what you did then? So you left the startup?
Yeah, so then I left the startup and went back to the bank that I initially started my career in and worked there for less than a year. Also in a consulting capacity, mostly just doing that. Back then they also used ESB, so connecting from one thing to another thing, passing data around. I'm doing a lot of performance enhancements, and then permanently joined an insurance company as a system architect. Yeah.
Now you were the guy who ordered the ESBs for the others, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. So now I could put a stop to that. When I joined that, I think that was pretty much the trend at the time, that the companies were mandated to use Java EE server. The developers didn't like it. Specifically this big brand that they didn't like. It was slow. They didn't have access to it. So they all developed Spring applications on top of it. I know that at that point, when a developer made a change, it would take half an hour before they can actually see the change because they have to rebuild. That took forever, and then redeploy onto this application server on their machine that actually is not powerful enough to run this application server, and then come back and try the change. So that was they just couldn't move. So yeah, part of the work that I've done at that insurance company, because at these big companies, everything goes through a big architecture forum. Things take years, but in the years that I've been there, I've managed to get an open source alternative application server approved by the architecture forum, and then switch to throw out Spring and just use whatever the framework gives you. And yeah, we've managed to actually start developing much quicker.
Yeah, this is what I never understood. I saw this pattern, that the reasoning back then was, we cannot change the application server, so we don't use anything from the application server, just put the servlet container, and then we pack, Spring on top of it. But they say, okay, but then it's even slower, I mean, then we have two application servers, basically. And I never got this, because what I try to do is to escalate. Say, okay, then we have to move faster, and either we switch the application servers or we upgrade the application servers. And interestingly enough, in most companies, if you mention that, something happened. But for unknown reasons, they bought the server once, and no one mentioned that they have to be upgraded, and they run, for years, and were completely outdated and unusable, basically. So this was the issue, communication issue, more or less. Which server you picked, Glassfish?
No, at that point, we actually did a few architects went out after we decided we're going to do it and evaluated a bunch of them. I proposed Payara, or I had to investigate Payara, and then, but we eventually went with Wildfly.
Payara is already late. It was after 2010, 2011, I guess, right? Because yeah. Wildfly also great choice, but and developers were happier.
Much happier. Yeah, much happier. We could actually also start recruiting developers, because it's also difficult to recruit a Java developer if you start telling them your environment, and then they're just like, I don't want to work like this. So yeah, we could definitely recruit better, and we definitely moved faster. It's also around that time that I created apart now from my Swing components that I did way back, I created a project called RP, which was basically Swagger and Swagger UI bundled and made it usable on Java EE, any Java EE application server. So you have this one dependency that you can add, and then you get Swagger because it's transitively pulled in, so you can annotate your code with your Swagger annotations, and you have a bundled Swagger UI that was configurable, because you can do some configuration on Swagger UI, but if you use a static Swagger UI, you can't really configure it. So this gave you that opportunity.
I remember at the beginning, Swagger was written in Scala, and the jar from Swagger was 50 megs. This is what I remember. It was big. And I say, you are all crazy with this Scala stuff. I mean, it cannot have, one jar is bigger than the entire application server. So I get what they are doing here, right?
Yeah. But RP, so we used it internally, but then I actually had some users worldwide that used it. It was open source in the sense that you can use the source, and it's still alive today. I had to do a
how it's spelled, OPI or API?
No, so API with with EE at the end. So API and EE. And RP is a monkey in Afrikaans.
Okay.
My first language here. So it's still used, but this was before MicroProfile, but then MicroProfile came out with MicroProfile Open API. And then I wanted to kind of have that, but for MicroProfile. So that's when I started. Initially, it was under my own name, MicroProfile Extensions. And then a guy named Derek Moran or something, I can't remember his surname, I don't know how to pronounce his surname, But he pinged me and said, this is cool. He wants to use it as well. So between me and him, we started microprofile extensions.
Uh-huh.
And then did a bunch of stuff. So, but mostly what was left of RP, which was really now that was Swagger UI minus Swagger, because we didn't need Swagger anymore because OpenAPI will bring it, and this will be a provided dependency by the framework that you use. So it really just gives you Swagger UI for microprofile. But
so you are the initiator of microprofile OpenAPI?
No, not of microprofile OpenAPI, just microprofile extensions. And microprofile extension at OpenAPI. At that point, I wasn't involved with microprofile apart from being a user. And the microprofile extensions also contain a lot of config sources. So initially, I wanted a config source that is a memory config source. So that was my first one because I wanted like a poor man's feature flag. And I used configuration for that. So now if it's in memory, you can just change it with a REST API. The problem was that if it's already loaded by a class, you want to kind of notify it. So it had this whole with CDI events way to listen for config changes and then update yourself. And that's still around. I don't know if it's how much it's used. Some of the ideas moved into Quarkus eventually. Not necessarily the code, but the concepts.
But one point of time we met at Java 1. This was 2015. Yeah. We learned you show me a picture. Yeah. Was it at that time?
No, I think it must have been after that. I can't remember actually. It could have been at that time. I'm not sure.
Because I remember interactions with you via email, but I couldn't remember that we took picture and we met actually at Java 1. This is the interesting part.
Yeah. It could have been because I remember the guy that I was with was with me at this insurance company, but I can't remember if it was before or after microprofile extensions, but yeah.
So you started to implement the Swagger on microprofile more or less, right? So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the Swagger that's in Quarkus today is kind of came from that as well. So initially, when I eventually joined Red Hat and then joined the Quarkus team, there was
when you joined Red Hat.
6 years ago. Where are we now? So 2024.
2018.
So, yeah, 2018 must be somewhere there. I didn't initially work in the team that I'm now. So I think only 20. So it was actually beginning 2019 that I joined Red Hat. Because end of this year will be 6 years. So 2019 and then 2020, I only joined the team that I'm in now, which is the Quarkus team. So when I joined this team, Quarkus existed.
How you joined Quarkus? How you left the insurance and joined Quarkus, or you wanted?
So I joined Red Hat. So at this insurance company, I built this microprofile extensions and then got involved with microprofile via microprofile GraphQL, which this insurance company where I worked at, we worked at the only non-insurance part of the insurance company. So we did, our department did the rewards. So if you have an insurance policy with us, we have this rewards program to kind of keep you interact and give you a positive, because usually insurance is a negative interaction with the client. You only deal with insurance when something bad happens. So we kind of try to turn that around and interact with the client more on a more regular basis in a positive fashion. So if you fit and you drive your car nicely, then we'll give you rewards. And that's also why we dealt with all the other parts. So we dealt with health insurance, which was a department on their own, and we dealt with short-term insurance, and we dealt with life insurance, and so we were kind of in the middle doing a lot of interaction with these different departments. And when I joined, it was all SOAP, but then we, as part of our revamp, we changed to REST APIs. And all these different departments wants to use our REST API, but they all have different requirements. So we soon realized there's like a one-to-one relationship. We have a REST service for this client, for this user, user being the other department. Then you have a REST client for the next one and a REST client for the next one, because they all have different requirements. And that's when I started looking into how can we make this more dynamic. And I started Googling and then came across GraphQL, which at the time wasn't something that Java developers knew about. There was a project called, it's still a project called Speaker, SPQR, that was created by Bowie and Tomic. So I initially used that Speaker on top of, at that point, Thorntail, and did my first demo at the company for the architecture forum again, to try and sell this concept of GraphQL. Because this will solve our problem, because now we'll have one GraphQL endpoint.
And it went well.
No, because that was also kind of, like I said, things take forever to change in these big companies. But that's when I started playing with it. I don't think they've ever implemented GraphQL. I left before we could really do anything there. Because then, because Speaker at the time was very Spring focused, and I wanted it to run on a Java E type environment.
So you didn't like Spring back then?
Yeah, it's not that I didn't like it, but I preferred, again, because we have an application server, use what you have.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I've done a lot of Spring in that startup. We've done a lot of Spring, especially Spring Web. So we use Spring Web there. But so then I was involved with MicroProfile from a point of view that I joined the meetings and listened in and understood what they did. So I, at that point, suggested on the mailing list this GraphQL specification, just to have a way to get it in. And then eventually Andy McCright from IBM said yes, he thinks it's a good idea. And because IBM is a big MicroProfile sponsor, that kind of got us to start on it. So me and Andy and a few others started the specification process. And it took about a year to get version 1 out of the spec. And at that point, before we got version 1 out, a lot of what we've done was based on Speaker. So Speaker was the implementation, and we just made a spec of it. Bojan, the author of Speaker, also joined us. So he joined us in our meetings and discussed things and decide how we're going to do things. So we basically just took a lot of the concepts of Speaker and just generalized them into an API. Yeah.
What were the other team members? It was you?
So it was me and Andy. There's a guy called Rudiger.
So Andy Guibert or?
Andy McCright.
Oh, McCright, okay.
Yeah. He left IBM now. I can't remember where he went, but yeah, he was at IBM at the time. Then there was Rudiger. That's a German guy. I'm not going to pronounce his surname correctly. Zudona or something like that. And then there was two guys from Worldline, John Francis, something James.
Okay, but just was interesting to know how big was the teams of?
Yeah, no, it was big. So it was, Andy was from IBM, and the rest was actually all non-vendor people. So me from the insurance company, Bojan from Speaker, John, the two from Worldline. It was John Francis James and John Baptiste something. And yeah, I think that was about it at the time. And then when we wanted to get the compatible implementation out, there was some pull requests that had to go into Speaker. And at the time, Bojan we didn't have the time to get it in, and we wanted to get this done. So I said, well, I'm going to create smaller GraphQL so that we can have a compatible implementation, so we can get the spec over the line. And that's also around the time that I then joined Red Hat. And I spoke to Ken Finnegan and said, we need a new SmallRye project, and just created, and we started SmallRye GraphQL. And the other good thing about it is that at that point, then I started learning about Quarkus, because that was around the time that Quarkus was.
But interesting part, somehow, either you notified me or what, because I tested the SmallRye implementation, I think. So, I think it was from you, and then I tried that, and you said something changes right now, so maybe you migrated to Quarkus or whatever. But
yeah, because the initial implementation was on Thorntail, or we tested it on Thorntail and a few others, and obviously on Liberty, WebSphere Liberty. But when I realized Quarkus exists, because back then it was, I don't think it was released, or it was just released as 0.17 or something. I realized that we have to change the implementation quite a lot so that we can do more things at build time. So the SmallRye GraphQL that we have today is kind of built customly so that it can work better on Quarkus. But it's also the implementation in Liberty and somewhere else. Is it Kumulutsi or one of those? Yeah. But I initially joined Red Hat in a solutions architect capacity, but I wasn't a very good solutions architect because I was mostly busy with this. So eventually, at the Java 1 in 2019, just before COVID, that must be 2018. Or 2019. Yeah, I spoke to Mark Little and said, I want to join your team. So they just said, yeah, cool. So that's how I got into the Quarkus team. And back then, it was more the SmallRye team. And that's when I then got OpenAPI as now you need to look after OpenAPI. So that's when I decided to move the learnings from microprofile extension OpenAPI into Quarkus. So now the Swagger UI inside Quarkus, a lot of the stuff comes from microprofile extensions that you can configure your OpenAPI. But the spec of OpenAPI was already done. Eric Whitman and Mike Edgar, also both at Red Hat. Back then Mike wasn't, but they both at Red Hat now. But the stuff that I've done on OpenAPI was mostly added support for Spring, because we have Spring support in Quarkus, as you know. You can code like you code Spring. It's not
This is a Spring compatibility layer, so
exactly.
So Quarkus understands the Spring annotations without using Spring, right?
Yeah, and now then the work that I've done was, so now if you add OpenAPI, we will also generate the spec from your Spring annotations. And then a lot of work on better defaults, because there's quite a lot of OpenAPI annotations that you add to your classes, and it just blows your class. But now our defaults is actually quite good. If you don't add anything, we will tag it correctly. We will add the security 80% correctly. We will add the operation correctly. The response types, all of that's fairly well done. We did better integration with other APIs like bean validation, so translated bean validation to basically OpenAPI.
This is huge. I tried to do that, and this was not easy. So the problem back then was that the microprofile OpenAPI didn't give you access to the real annotations. So what I remember, this was like a abstracted model in the OpenAPI spec. So if there was, how it's called, OpenAPI model, I think. So where it contained all the type information. But if you had the types, you were not able to ask, to get the reference to the annotation, because what I wanted to do is, to ask the bean validation. So, okay, give me now, the bean validation annotation. And this back then was not easily possible for the application developer back then.
So. It's not easy for the application developer. The reason why we could do it is because we created the implementation. So inside SmallRye OpenAPI, we have a reference to the method. And that's how we can tie it back to that method, and then we can find it in Jandex and find all the annotations that's on there, and use the tools to actually add to the OpenAPI spec. And then so apart from GraphQL implementation that I looked after in OpenAPI, I then started looking at that time the Dev UI came out. So this was 2 years ago, maybe a bit more. And I actually had.
What is your opinion of GraphQL? Because for me, it was overhyped. And the GraphQL, if you do it right, is more. You are decoupled, but you need someone who to provide the resolver. So you have to implement a bit more.
So when we did GraphQL, one of the main goals of the spec was to make it as easy as REST. So I don't know if you've looked at the latest GraphQL that we have, but it's no more difficult for a developer to create a GraphQL endpoint than it is to create a REST endpoint.
It was back then. It was also easy, but the problem is, if you have a GraphQL, then you call the GraphQL endpoint, and there has to be some translation between the GraphQL and the REST endpoints, right? So you could
So there's no REST if you just use GraphQL. There's no REST.
Of course. Then it's easy because you can go with GraphQL and go to database. But usually, how GraphQL was built or used in enterprises, so you had the REST APIs anyway. And what GraphQL did is it just translated the flexible view to REST calls. This is what happened in the wild. Just of course, if you have just GraphQL, then it's as easy as REST, right? Because you get called and you can do whatever you like. So this is
probably some people took their REST APIs and tried to make them GraphQL. But if you've done your REST correctly and you've decoupled your service from your actual REST, then you should be able to just put on a new endpoint for REST, and you can for GraphQL, so you can have both. But I'm sure it depends on what you work with, how easy it is. I like it. I wouldn't necessarily say you always have to use it, but so in cases where you know that I always want all the data back, the REST is better because you don't have the thing that needs to figure out what is it that this person wants. So you're going to add overhead without using it. But if you are in a situation where you want to have multiple clients and they must all be able to tell you what they want, then I think GraphQL is a good option. And the other nice thing about GraphQL is that you don't have, two things that you don't have in REST automatically is documentation. So with REST, you have to add OpenAPI to get it. With GraphQL, you get it by default. So it's type safe in the API itself, which is why if you test it out, you can actually see what fields you can pass in the GraphQL UI. What was the second thing I wanted to mention? So it's the documentation.
The discovery, you guys, right?
Yeah, but the other thing is it's got built-in support for subscriptions. So it's very easy to stream data up and down.
But you dropped interest on with GraphQL and do some in Dev UI.
It's not that I dropped interest. It's just I had to kind of move on.
Yeah.
GraphQL, I'm still kind of involved with GraphQL, but probably more just from a looking over it. And I think it's at a point where you just maintain it. We actually just started to try and get a new version out of the spec because there's a lot of things in SmallRye that's not in the spec yet. For an example, the subscriptions.
But the GraphQL is not official part of the micro profile, right?
No, it's a standalone spec,
Why not?
Yeah. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know what the process is to get it there and if it will ever get there. And
I will tomorrow meet Emily, so I will ask her.
Yeah, she might know. But there's a lot of things in SmallRye GraphQL that will move up to spec level soon. There's Keto. You probably know Keto Man. He's trying to revive or to get this done because we just didn't have the time to do it. But we've actually the stuff that we've done inside SmallRye GraphQL, we know we've put it in a specific package, an API package, because we know this needs to move up to the spec. But the whole idea of microprofile was that we first bake things in the implementation, and once it's ready, we move it up. And I think it works well. There's a few things, like we have this concept of adaptation, which is similar to in JSON. You can adapt a GraphQL object to a Java object and change how it works. And yeah, that changed a few times while we baked it, but I think it's ready to kind of move to the spec now. So I think the process works well. It's just the time to now move it to the spec. But yeah, then I moved on to Dev UI. The first Dev UI was a server-side rendering with Qt templates. And I started adding things in there. One of the first things that I've added there was the log stream, so that you can see the log file inside Dev UI. But that's all JavaScript and WebSockets. So the two didn't really work nicely together because the Dev UI if you click a link, it refreshes the page, which breaks your WebSocket connection.
One question, because Dev UI is interesting. Should we make here a cut? And I will invite you back just to talk about Dev UI, maybe, because it's a current, this could be interesting because now we had the audio. And what I remember as well, this was also crazy. You invited me to a conference, Java Cloud conference in 2019.
Yes.
In South Africa, but I had no time. And I said, no problem. I can work in an airplane, I can fly, and then I can speak and fly back. And I look at the flight, it's doable. And you said it is not doable. I said, of course it's doable. I mean, I can work in the airplane. And this is what I remember. This was the last touch we had. I think it was 2019. Yes. And I thought it was earlier, but it was in 2019. So it was like not that long ago. It was, before the pandemic, actually, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
And did the conference went well? Was it a big one or?
Yeah. The conference went well. It's still kind of going, but I think COVID killed a lot of like smaller conferences. That conference would have been like maybe 400 people.
Okay.
In the Joburg and the Johannesburg leg, and then there used to be a Cape Town leg as well, which would have been a bit smaller. But yeah, I think if you ever can do it, you need you're actually quite popular in South Africa, and I think people would definitely come out and see.
This is what I didn't suspect, because I never was in South Africa actually, and and also ask you, was I surprised by the entire Java, culture in South Africa, that it was that popular? So it seems like there are lots going on with Java in South Africa, right?
Yeah, I think so. I would say it's, at least, I don't know now anymore, but when I was working there, insurance companies, banks, they all use it. And there's no real big tech shops there. So if you're a developer, there's a high chance that you're going to work in one of these and use Java. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
There's a lot of .NET as well. .NET's quite big there, but yeah. And even up in Africa, Java is fairly big. I've done some work up in Africa, Tanzania, some big Java shops there.
Okay, cool. So Philip, where people can find you on the internet?
Probably X or Twitter. It's just at Philip Kruger. So Philip with 2 L's, Kruger, one word. But I think the easiest would actually be Zulip. So Zulip, the Quarkus, the Quarkus channel in Zulip. But that's about it. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'm looking forward, to the Dev UI, because I like also web components. What I can tell you. So
I know that. I know you like web components, and I've actually looked at web components since they came out. I was still at the startup, and when smartphones came out, we started looking at, can we pivot and use it? And I was looking at web components back then. Probably wasn't ready back then, but I think at the moment it's awesome.
Yeah, really looking forward to it. Thank you a lot.
Thanks.
See you next time.